Hello, this is Joshua Willard, and you are listening to the Chameleon Breeder podcast.
You've come to the place where we discuss the art and science of chameleon keeping. We explore, share, and go beyond just keeping a pet, learning about the world through our love for these modern-day dragons. This is the Chameleon Breeder podcast, and I'm your host, Bill Strand.
Welcome, chameleon wranglers, to another episode of the Chameleon Breeder podcast. Do you know what time it is? Yes, it is time for another episode of the Outer Fringes. For those new to the podcast, our Outer Fringes series of episodes covers some other corner of this natural world that a chameleon keeper might be interested in. We do this roughly once a month. Today's Outer Fringes episodes takes us to a different world than we arboreal artists are used to. We're going to go down to the forest floor and explore keeping dart frogs. I'm extra excited about this interview because it is with a hero of mine. Josh Willard is the founder of Josh's Frogs. His story is a true slice of American entrepreneurship. And I'm not going to make this introduction any longer than it has to be because I want you to hear his story in his own words. And then we're going to dive into those living jewels of nature. Josh, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to the chameleon community today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Love doing these kind of interviews, exposing people to dart frogs and kind of removing some of the fears that people might have about keeping those. I think any of your people that are keeping chameleons could very easily keep dart frogs as well and kind of solve that fruit fly problem of having fruit flies ready when your babies are hatching.
That's right. Yeah, I've kept dart frogs for a long time. I've raised them up from tadpoles, and I've had them breed in my vivarium, and it is just a pleasure to have them around.
Yep.
Now, Josh, between Apple, Hewlett-Packard, and countless others, there is one component necessary to the perfect American success story. It would be the garage. Please share with us how 12 years ago, a guy who enjoyed dart frogs took a garage and built things up to what many people would consider being a dream job.
Well, Bill, it actually started before the garage. It started in an apartment building, actually. My wife and I didn't have a lot of income, and keeping exotic animals was always something that I had done since I was very, very young, whether we'd caught the frogs or snakes in the local swamp, or whether I'd gone to the local pet store and got my first ball python and map turtle and that kind of stuff. So when my wife and I were married, I wanted to keep some exotic animals, but we just didn't have the cash to allow that to happen. So I did some research and found out about poison dart frogs and saw an opportunity. You needed cups to do fruit fly cultures. So what I did is I bought cups in bulk, and I used some of the cups for my own fruit fly cultures, and I sold off the rest of the extra cups, and I was able to pay for the tank of frogs in our living room. So I guess it started 12 years ago with me filling our apartment bedroom with cases of fruit fly cups and selling off the extras so that I could keep my tank of frogs there in our living room.
Wow, that was pre-garage. You had to graduate to a garage.
Yeah, we were in an apartment for a couple of years. After the fruit fly cups started taking off, I started messing around with fruit fly media. There were a couple of issues with the fruit fly medias that were on in the market at the time. So I started in our kitchen sink developing fruit fly media and testing it out there in that spare bedroom in our apartment. And it just really took off from there. And then we finally moved out of the apartment into a house, and my wife was gracious enough to give me the basement. And so Josh's Frogs grew to encompass our entire basement. And then after that, my wife was gracious enough to start parking out in our driveway. And
Oh, no.
I graduated to the garage as well.
Oh, wow. So you had to earn your way to the garage.
That's right.
Well, this is actually a slight departure from what I normally do on this podcast, because usually I explore an animal that has similar arboreal requirements, which makes them an easy jump for a chameleon person. But dart frogs break that mold a bit as they're terrestrial. But they're actually one of the most talked about non-chameleon herps on this podcast. because I'm always suggesting that people get them, as it ensures you'll never run out of fruit flies. And they're just so much fun to raise up. But I think we're going to have to start at the beginning because we are chameleon people here. So be patient with us. Let's start off with understanding just what are dart frogs.
Well, dart frogs as a term apply to South American dart frogs. There are some Madagascar species that some people would consider dart frogs, the mantellas, which are from Madagascar. But for all intents and purposes, when people are talking dart frogs, they're mainly talking about the South American species dart frogs, which when I started the hobby were all dendrobates. But now, as scientists need to make a living, they're splitting the names and changing the names all over the place. So, there are from Uhufaga to Ranatomea to dendrobates to Phyllobates. There's a lot of different species now that are under the umbrella of dart frogs from South America.
With a wide range of species available to us, which ones would you consider the best ones for us to start off with?
Well, when it comes to poison dart frogs, there's really three different categories that we like to group poison dart frogs in. The first group would be the thumbnails. Those are all frogs that don't get bigger than your thumbnail their entire life. So about, anywhere from 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. So really small frogs. And in that category, you can get anywhere from $40 frogs up to hundreds and sometimes even over $1,000 a frog.
Wow.
From species that are pretty commonly kept to species that aren't as common and therefore, have much higher price tag just because they're not going to produce as many babies in a year. So just not as much supply of those guys. So the thumbnails probably are the intermediate type of frog where people who have been keeping frogs for a little bit will move on to those specialized frogs just because of the price tag and then also escapability. They need a very secure terrarium when you're talking about a frog that small. The next group of frogs would be the Phyllobates. The reason those guys get separated from the other larger frogs is because they tend to breed a little bit differently. They tend to be explosive breeders, laying clutches of over a dozen eggs, sometimes up to 2 dozen eggs at a time. And they require temperatures to be a little bit cooler than what other dart frogs can handle, especially something that people keeping chameleons want to keep an eye on. These type of frogs, the Phyllobates, you want to keep them under 80 degrees at all times. You never want them getting above 80. They don't do well in those warmer temperatures. And then the third category would be probably the most common dart frogs, and definitely the ones that we ask people to begin with, would be the Tinctorius group, Leucomelis group, Auratus group, the larger poison dart frogs that you see probably most commonly available. And definitely of that group, probably the most common poison dart frog would be the Azurius, which gets its name from the Spanish word for blue. It's the blue poison dart frog with black dots. So, definitely one of the most striking visually, but also one of the most easiest to keep.
So if we're going to be choosing between those species, what should we consider beyond just our color preference? Or are they pretty similar?
They are similar. There's one of the things that comes up a lot when we're talking about poison dart frogs is mixing, but kind of connected to that is what frogs do well in groups. And when it comes to Tinctorius group, which is which as a rule of thumb is any frog that has blue on it, that group just doesn't tend to do very well in groups when they get sexually mature. And so you want to keep those guys in pairs, sometimes even trios, but most of the time you want to keep those guys in pairs. So if you're doing a very large tank, say a 40-gallon, 50-gallon, or even bigger than that, when you work with Tinctorius, any of those guys with blue, you're kind of pigeonholing yourself into having 2, maybe 3 frogs in the tank. And so that's a lot of space for just 2 frogs. And so something to consider if you're going with a larger tank like that is working with some of the frogs that do better in groups. So some of the ones that do better in groups are the Leucomelis, which are the yellow and black poison dart frog, or any of their Auratus, which come in many, many different colors, or some of the thumbnails or Phyllobates. Those guys do well in groups. And so something to consider if you're doing a larger tank, that you might want to go with one of those group species so you can have many more frogs than just a pair in a larger tank.
And how about their call? Which ones would you say have the best call, and which ones are the loudest, and which ones would be the quietest?
Yeah, the really cool thing about frogs in general is that almost every frog sounds totally different than the next frog. And the poison dart frogs are not an exception to that. It's pretty amazing. Frogs that look pretty similar have drastically different calls. And I like to say it's, nature's way of making sure you don't show up at the wrong party. It's amazing. From some of them sound kind of like canaries, all the way down to certain poison dart frogs sound like bugs, maybe a chirping sound. So there's quite a different range in sounds. The azurius, which tends to be the most commonly purchased dart frog, those guys sound kind of like an electric razor, kind of a hum. When it comes to loud, kind of enjoyable calls, the phyllobates and leucomelis have a similar sound. It's like a canary sound, but not quite as loud. Definitely not deafening or anything like that, but it definitely is audible. Whereas, some of the Tinctorius group, the azurius, that electric razor sound just isn't very audible, especially when you're filling the tank up. It's just not very loud. So a lot of people like leucomelis or the phyllobates just because of their call. It's, a very tranquil, very soothing type call. It's not startling and it's not too loud, but it's definitely loud where if you're in, one room and you have the frogs off in your bedroom, you can hear them calling. And the nice thing about poison dart frogs is they're diurnal, which means they're awake during the day. So they're calling during the day instead of in the middle of the night, which is not true of a lot of frogs.
Yeah, I had a Phyllobates terribilis, and that's the famous poison dart frog that they use that they make the poison arrows from. But I have that. He had the most incredible call, and we could hear it from the other side of the house. And every time he started in on his call, everybody would go, Frogger, because that's what my son named him. It was a great ambiance call. Mm-hmm. Yep. And but then I took a frog to work, and I had him sitting on my desk. And for that, I chose an azurius. That's the blue dart frog, because its call was very low. And so it was a look at me, but it wasn't going to be bothering my coworkers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the nice thing about that is not only are they the calls something that you have to consider when it's around groups of people, but in an office setting, poison dart frogs are pretty visible. And the reason for that is they still think that they're poisonous. So they're not as skittish as other animals are. And so, for an office setting, poison dart frogs do make great exhibit animals in that kind of setting.
So let's talk about this poison skin.
In the wild, the dart frogs are eating ants that are eating poisonous plants. And so it creates this kind of cycle where the dart frogs are able to utilize the poison from those plants using the ants as a carrier for that. And so in captivity, since we're not feeding those ants that are eating those poisonous plants, they're totally harmless. And so the cool thing about that is that they still think that they're poisonous, and so they're less skittish than other exotic animals are. People are always shocked when they come into our facility and walk down any of the rows of our breeders, and they're right at the front of the glass because, here they've begun to associate people with food, and so they're super bold and out in the front, ready for the fruit flies to be dumped in.
So, how long do dart frogs live?
Well, that's a great question. For some of the larger dart frogs, decades. About 7 years ago, I purchased a group of Nicaraguan aratus that were actually, the guy was saying, between 18 and 20 years old at the time.
Wow.
So they can live quite a long time. We're not seeing that for some of the smaller thumbnails, and I would probably put those right around the 10-year to 15-year max. But some of the larger frogs, definitely multiple decades.
Wow. Well, let's talk about that life cycle. Where does it start and how do they grow?
Well, the cool thing about poison dart frogs is twofold. One is that they breed regularly. Most frogs, tree frogs, red eyes, any of the frogs that we'd have local here in the United States are kind of once a year type breeders for the most part. They lay big, huge clutches of eggs, usually in the spring, and then the tadpoles develop, and then you get frogs later that summer or the fall. And poison dart frogs are a little bit different in that they tend to breed in smaller clutches regularly. Some frogs nearly year-round. will breed anywhere from 2 eggs all the way up to a couple dozen eggs, depending on the species. And so they'll lay those eggs sometimes as frequently as every week to 10 days. And some of the dart frogs tend to be a little bit more seasonally. Leucomelas are a good example of that, tend to breed more during the spring and during the fall. So they don't produce as many babies as a lot of the tinctorius frogs that tend to breed most of the year. But the way it works in poison dart frogs is a little bit different, and that where they're at, there doesn't tend to be a lot of standing water for the tadpoles. So there's a lot of parental care when it comes to poison dart frogs and breeding. So what happens is the male will find a good spot to hide the eggs, and poison dart frogs tend to lay eggs on leaves, usually on leaves on the forest floor, so in between leaves to kind of hide the eggs. So he'll find a good.
Where did the male get the eggs?
He finds the spot to lay the eggs, and then he'll call the female to that spot.
Okay.
So he kind of finds the nursery for the eggs to be laid. So
what
he'll find a spot. Yeah, he'll find a spot, call her over there. She'll lay the eggs, and then he'll fertilize the eggs. And then he'll actually do a little bit of parental care on those eggs. He'll come and he'll urinate on the eggs because, like I said, these aren't eggs that are being laid in water. So they're actually, out in the open, covered up by some leaves. So he'll come back and urinate on the leaves, not only to rehydrate them, but also to keep any mold, fungus, bacteria from developing on those eggs, kind of sterilizing it with his urine. So he'll do that for a couple of weeks. It usually takes anywhere from 12 to 20 days for those eggs to hatch. And once they hatch, he'll actually transport those tadpoles to some water. So certain dart frogs will use bromeliads, which are plants that hold water in the center of them, that are epiphytes, which means they grow on the side of trees. So he'll deposit those tadpoles in bromeliads, or he'll deposit them in little puddles that have formed, or in some cases even, a body of water, a little pond or a river or whatnot. So he'll actually move the tadpoles, and most dart frogs will scatter the tadpoles around. The issue being that dart frog tadpoles are cannibalistic. They'll actually eat their brothers and sisters. So along that line, there are certain dart frogs, the Uuphaga are a good example, where that male will deposit the baby or the tadpole in a bromeliad, and then he'll actually call the female back to that bromeliad, and she'll deposit unfertilized eggs to actually feed that dart frog. So pretty amazing, in something as small as a dart frog that's 3/4 of an inch, you have the male taking care of the eggs, then transporting the tadpoles, and then calling back the female back to those tadpoles, because she doesn't know where he put them. He has to call her back to those, and so that she can lay eggs to feed those. So pretty amazing parental skills in these dart frogs.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised. I have a group of Leucomelas, and at one point I saw a Leucomela with what looked like a fluke or some crazy thing on its back, because I wasn't trying to breed them, and obviously, we don't communicate like that, and they do what they do. That's the first time I saw a dart frog carrying around a tadpole. It was pretty shocking.
Yeah. It is pretty shocking. I mean, when you think about exotic animals, and even up to up through mammals, I mean, there's just pretty striking a lot of parental activity in that caring for their young. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, the dart frog life cycle is an amazing one, and it's wonderful to watch.
And that's one of the things that drives people to keeping poison dart frogs. Is, like I said, it's not a one time a year experience. That a lot of these dart frogs are doing this kind of activity throughout the year. So it's an ongoing observation that you get to do.
So say we want to start off with a dart frog. What kind of cage do we need?
The key with poison dart frogs is you want to use between 5 and 10 gallons per dart frog that you're going to keep in that cage. And so most poison dart frogs are kept in glass terrariums. So either the Exoterra Zoomed, the front opening tanks, or even our fish tank as well. But The key to keeping them is actually getting rid of any kind of screen top that's on the cage and using all glass. You want to kind of seal that tank up because poison dart frogs need between 80 and 100% humidity at all times. And, inside of our houses, that's really hard to do with any type of screen cages. So if you are going to use one of the commercially available Exoterra ZooMed type tanks that I'm sure a lot of your chameleon people are familiar with, you're going to want to take that screen off and replace it with a piece of glass.
So where do you get a piece of glass to replace it with?
That's a great question. You'd be shocked at how many glass shops actually exist in every town, and calling them up with the measurements and asking for a piece of glass is actually really a lot cheaper than most people think it is. Here in Michigan, we get glass for about $4 a square foot. So you're talking on that 18 size terrarium. You're looking at less than $10 to have a piece of glass cup that covers the top of that cage.
All right, so what kind of environment do they need? Obviously, you said high humidity. So what about temperature and basic cage composition?
Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that sets poison dart frogs apart from a lot of the other animals that you can keep in the exotic category. Poison dart frogs a couple of decades ago were nearly impossible to keep. Breeders were not having success because they were trying to keep them much like we keep reptiles nowadays and even in the last couple of decades. And so the idea was brought over from the fish community of creating a kind of ecosystem for the frogs. And so setting up what became known as naturalistic terrariums became the standard for keeping poison dart frogs and led to a lot of the success that many of the early breeders were able to have. So in that kind of setup, what you'll want is some kind of drainage layer on the bottom. And the only purpose that this drainage layer serves is to collect the excess water that runs through the system so that it's not saturating the system. So you have that false bottom layer, and then you're going to put a screen over that. And then on top of that screen, you're going to put the terrarium substrate. The most common terrarium substrate for poison dart frogs is a mix that was designed by the Atlanta Botanical Garden. In the poison dart frog community, for short, we just call that ABG mix. But that botanical garden there in Atlanta developed this mix for keeping poison dart frogs in terrariums. And so in that substrate, you're going to plant live terrarium plants in that substrate. And the whole point of this system is so that the frogs are eating the bugs and producing waste, which those plants are utilizing as fertilizer. So it creates its own kind of ecosystem. It's its own chunk of the rainforest right there in a glass cage. And so that allows you to keep the humidity up because the plants are putting out moisture and absorbing some of the excess moisture from the misting. And then it's also utilizing the waste from the frogs as fertilizer for those plants. So it creates its own circle of life right there in the terrarium. And to establish that, you'll use microfauna, little tiny bugs that'll help utilize some of that waste from the frogs and help break it down so that plants can use it. So bugs such as springtails and isopods are used in those terrariums to just create more of a circle of life right there inside that terrarium, so that you're not have to come in and cleaning the tank on a regular basis, all those kind of things that are going to upset that system. It just becomes its own circle of life right there inside the tank.
All right, well, let's talk about the temperature ranges and how we keep those temperatures in those ranges.
Yeah, for most poison dart frogs, keeping them in the 70s is totally fine. I mentioned earlier those phyllobates, you want to keep those below 80 at all times. The other Tinctorius type groups, most of those guys, Leucomelis, can get into the low 80s, but definitely not above 85. Poison dart frogs tend to be on the forest floor of the rainforest, where it's a little bit cooler than up in the trees out exposed to the sun. So they like it a little bit cooler than what a lot of exotic animals, maybe even some of the chameleons that you guys are keeping, would like it. So in those kind of environments, we recommend that the scary time becomes summer when it starts to get really warm.
Yeah.
So keeping an eye on your lighting situation and making sure those lights are getting turned off when it's getting warm inside of your house or your herp room or wherever it is that you're keeping your poison dart frogs, to make sure that they're not getting over that 80 degrees. Because with a sealed tank like that, without the screen top, when you put lights on top of it, it can raise that tank, depending on the lighting you're using, anywhere from 1 or 2 degrees up to close to 10 degrees, depending on what types of lights you're using on that tank. So something you got to keep in mind during the summer months is making sure that you're keeping an eye on temperatures inside the tank and adjusting the lighting accordingly.
So what kind of lighting do we need?
Well, that's the interesting part of keeping dart frogs is that as people keep them, some people get more involved in the setup of the actual poison dart frog tank than actually the frogs. And so it depends on what types of plants you're using in that dart frog vivarium. If you're using green, tropical, broadleaf plants and vines, normal fluorescent lights will work out totally fine. So whether those long tube fluorescents or the spiral compact fluorescents, either of those will work really fine. And, it's a marketing gimmick to get those grow light type fluorescents. Any type of fluorescent will work out fine for a poison dart frog vivarium to give those plants enough light to actually grow. And one thing to keep in mind is the dart frogs, while they need light to be able to see, they don't need any special lighting. But the special lighting comes into play if you're going to use plants such as bromeliads, orchids, more specialized plants that need brighter light, that need full sun. Then you'll want to use LEDs. They produce tons and tons of light, but they don't produce a ton of heat. So in the last 5 or 6 years, LEDs have really become very popular with poison dart frog terrariums just because it allows you to grow much more exotic plants and to keep plants such as those bromeliads colored up. So those reds and purples and pinks that you see in bromeliads, those need a lot of light to show up. Otherwise, those bromeliads just turn green. So LEDs are very popular with people who want to make a very colorful, vibrant terrarium for their frogs, to make kind of the tank the showpiece in addition to the frogs.
As chameleon keepers, we're acutely aware of the animal's need for UVB and D3. But with a glass top, you're not getting any UVB into that cage.
Yeah.
Now, how does that work?
Yeah, the poison dart frogs, because they're on the forest floor and usually in between leaves and the leaf litter area of the rainforest floor, they're not getting a lot of sunlight at all. So most poison dart frogs can be kept without any UVB at all their entire life. And, we've bred generation upon generation without any UVB. But we are seeing some UVB needs with certain frogs, especially the Pamelio and their young babies. There's been a lot of people that have had a lot of success with doing a little bit of screen on the tank and doing some UVB for those guys. Especially when they're younger, it's really hard to dust properly the smaller prey items like springtails that you need for some of those smaller frogs when they morph out. They just aren't able to take fruit flies quite yet. And so you're not able to dust them as well as you would like. And so that UVB has been shown to be quite beneficial for keeping some of those species. But as a whole, with poison dart frogs, you can skip the UVB part of keeping them just because it's just not needed. And in the wild, they're just not exposed to that much sunlight.
So how do they get their vitamin D3?
It's all through supplements. Fruit flies are very easily dusted with a multivitamin and calcium supplement. We here at Josh's Frogs, we alternate between Repashy, Calcium Plus, Herptovite, and RepCal, calcium with D3, as well as Dendrocare, which is an all-in-one supplement specifically designed for dart frogs. So we alternate between all three of those, and so they're getting that D3 through actually eating, through the supplements that they're getting on those fruit flies.
Okay, in the chameleon community, we're trying to go towards a more UVB centric approach to that. Is that at all of interest in the dart frog community?
We have, like I mentioned, we've seen some of that success with Pamelio. The issue with using UVB on a broad spectrum for the hobby would be that most people's houses, especially in the middle of summer and in the middle of winter, are anywhere from 5 to 15% humidity. And so any type of screen on that dart frog tank, would be very hard to keep it above 65 to 70%, which is way too dry for those poison dart frogs. So, if we were in an environment where poison dart frogs needed UVB, the hobby would shrink considerably, just because not many people would be able to keep them inside their home, just because it's just too dry to allow that kind of screen. So, and then I know on top of that, there have been some people using the plexiglass that's in tanning beds.
And there's some greenhouses that have the UVB permeable. Is that the right word? The UVB goes through them.
Yep. And so there's been some people in the poison dart frog community that have moved to that type of Lexan type top. The issue is any of those types of acrylic or plastic tops, when they're in that kind of humidity that dart frogs need, they tend to warp pretty easily. And unfortunately, when that top starts warping a little bit, it creates openings for frogs to get out. So there hasn't been a real good solution yet to that. We're just pretty lucky that dart frogs don't tend to be hampered by not getting the UVB like most of the reptiles would. From chameleons to bearded dragons. That those hobbies without UVB would be non-existent.
Yeah. All right. So how do they get their water, and how do they drink?
Yep. Like most frogs, they get the water and moisture through their skin. So in a poison dart frog vivarium, you'll want to be misting on a regular basis, not only to keep the tank humidity, but to wash off any waste from the frogs down into the tank floor where it can be utilized by those plants. So they're going to get that moisture or that drinking through their skin through the dampness of the terrarium.
Should we have any standing water in our terrarium?
As a rule of thumb, we advise against standing water. It just creates unusable space in the terrarium because the frogs don't utilize that space. It's kind of dead space for the frogs. And since they're not, the poison dart frogs don't drink, they tend to, not utilize that water at all. Some exceptions to that would be sometimes when frogs are really stressed or when frogs are not doing so well. They will tend to try to seek out water and soak. And then the other exception to that is to utilize some of that parental care tendencies of poison dart frogs, especially with some of the larger explosive breeders, that Phyllobates group that tend to have a lot of tadpoles. We'll put 8-ounce cups of water inside the terrariums and allow the parents to deposit the tadpoles in those cups. It just gives them an opportunity to have some place to drop those tadpoles off. So in those cases, yeah, we will. But for the most part, the water features that people put in tanks are for our own benefit. It looks kind of cooler in a dart frog tank, and if you have a large tank, having some kind of water feature in it does look really, really cool. But as far as the frogs are considered, it's not something that they're going to utilize or use.
All right. So if they're taking it directly into their skins, is there any concern on water quality?
Yeah, definitely. Most of our tap water has a lot of pretty nasty stuff, chlorine being the biggest culprit. So you want to, in the olden days, we used to age our tap water and set it out in a pitcher overnight for 24 hours to hopefully evaporate a lot of that chlorine. But now there's commercially available water dechlorinators, water conditioners that'll take the chlorine out immediately. So utilizing those with dart frogs definitely is a lot safer. And the other issue too with poison dart frogs, and to some degree, I'm sure you guys experience this with chameleons, is that depending on where you live, some places have really hard water, and so you get those hard water stains on the glass.
Yeah.
So something like a poison dart frog, where you're putting a lot of water into the tank, those kind of hard water stains can build up over time. So that's why most poison dart frog people tend to have an RO unit for that reason, and also too because a lot of people that keep poison dart frogs tend to be fish people as well, and so they have an RO unit for that. But getting distilled water or spring water from your supermarket can also dissipate that, and that tends to be a lot softer water depending on where that supermarket is getting the water from, and so that can alleviate a lot of those hard water stains.
Okay. What do they eat?
Poison dart frogs are specialized feeders. So in the wild, they have to eat those ants that are eating those poisonous plants their entire lifespan. So from the time they come out of the water to full adults, they're eating the same size prey items. So in that way, poison dart frogs won't eat anything larger than about 1/8 of an inch. So in captivity here in the United States, the options for bugs are springtails, isopods, pinhead crickets, and fruit flies. And fruit flies tend to be the staple just because they're the easiest to gather, the cheapest food source for poison dart frogs. But really, you're pretty pigeonholed in what you can do that way because it has to be small. So there's other bugs that have kind of become more popular over the last 5 years, from bean beetles to rice flower beetles. You want really small prey items to feed the poison dart frogs. The exception to that would be on the Phyllobates, terribilis, or bicolor. Some of those guys will eat 1/4 inch, even 1/2 inch crickets. A little bit different as far as dart frogs, but for the most part, poison dart frogs aren't going to eat anything over 1/8 of an inch long. So definitely a fruit fly specialist.
And it doesn't sound like they get bored of the same food item.
No. They readily eat. Frogs are kind of feast or famine feeders. So what that means is when there is food present, they eat as much as they possibly can. So it does create an issue with people keeping dart frogs and not understanding that principle. They tend to overeat and overfeed their dart frogs just because the frogs will continue to eat and eat and eat because they're conditioned to think, hey, if there's food available, I need to eat it because there are certain times where the bugs just aren't as plentiful. And so their capacity to store a lot of fat, is pretty unique to frogs. And so something you need to keep in mind when you're keeping poison dart frogs is, not overfeeding them because they just will eat and eat and eat.
So how much and how often should we feed them?
The rule of thumb that we like to use here is feeding every other day. And when you feed the frog, what you'll want is the next day, when, say, you feed on a Monday, you want to look in the tank on Tuesday, and you want to be able to see at least a couple of fruit flies. You want to see that some made it an extra 24 hours. Now, if you feed on Monday, you look in the tank on Tuesday, yeah, I see some flies. And then when it's Wednesday, it's ready to feed again. You want to not be able to see any flies. You want them to have gotten most, if not all, of the flies by then, and then feeding there on Wednesday to keep the same pattern going. So you want to be able to see some flies in there on Thursday, and then on Friday. It's all right to see 1 or 2 flies, but you don't want to see a bunch of flies there. You don't want them to have access to food at all times.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask for a little insider knowledge here. It's coming up to the cold months up north of the equator here. How do we keep fruit fly cultures going during this season?
Yeah, fruit flies like to be a little bit warmer than room temperature. The best weather for fruit flies is around that 75 to 77 degrees temperature range, but that's really hard for most hobbyists to keep. So there are ways in which to kind of raise the temperature on fruit flies to keep them warm enough, and that's keeping them inside those Sterilite drawer systems. A lot of people use those like in their bathrooms or whatnot to store stuff, but they're the plastic drawer systems, and keeping the fruit flies in there can help in 2 ways. One is fruit fly cultures produce heat, and so if you keep them enclosed in something like that, that traps that heat and raises the temperature a little bit. And it also helps with the number 1 killer for fruit fly cultures, and that's low humidity. When the humidity drops, that top of that media starts to dry out, and that's just not conducive for producing fruit flies, and so keeping that humid. So a lot of people will use those Sterilite drawer systems and place a little bit of water in the bottom of that drawer system to keep the temperature up, but also during the winter months, keeping a spray bottle near your fruit fly cultures. And so when you feed out some of the fruit fly culture, some of the flies out of that culture to feed your animals, taking that spray bottle and spraying the culture a little bit to keep that top of that media moist. So during the winter, it's not, the cold does affect, it slows down the fruit flies, but the major number 1 killer is going to be the low humidity.
All right. Well, my goal for this winter here, and winter being these cold months, because we do have listeners south of the equator, I'm going to keep fruit flies this entire season. That's my New Year's resolution.
Good.
I'm going to do it on my own. So, all right. We've talked about keeping groups together and how the Tinctorius group needs to be in pairs or at most trios. And Leucomellas, they can be in a little bit more of a community. Is that correct?
Yeah, Leucomelis can be kept in communities. The issue is with certain dart frogs, the males and females will be territorial and they won't want other males or females in their area. And poison dart frogs are really, really aggressive when it comes to other males or other females being in their area. They'll fight, they'll tackle, they'll pin each other down. It's pretty amazing to look at some of the pictures that people have captured of the aggression that happens. It's just, kind of mind blowing that there's that much wrestling going on in poison dart frog tanks. When it comes to some of the group frogs, they tend not to be as aggressive in that way. They tend to be more passive aggressive, I guess I would call it. The Leucomelis being a great example of that. The females and males don't tend to fight as much. But what happens if you're keeping Leucomelis in groups is the females will oftentimes start eating each other's eggs. So that's kind of a frustrating point to be in, where you can see, hey, I've got calling, hey, I've got, I can see them laying eggs, and then all of a sudden the next day they disappear because another female came in and ate the eggs. So sometimes you'll see that kind of passive aggressive type of behavior, but there doesn't tend to be in those group frogs. There doesn't tend to be the tackling, the throwing each other around and pinning each other down type WrestleMania type activity. They just tend to be a little bit more passive aggressive. But in other cases, we've bred Phyllobates in groups, and we've bred Leucomelis in groups without issues. So something to just keep in mind and keep an eye on when you're keeping frogs.
So would you say that ideally speaking, dart frogs would be kept individually?
If you want to maximize production from frogs, if your goal is to produce as many dart frogs as possible, you'd probably lean more towards keeping them in pairs as you would in groups. But even us here as a business, we keep a lot of groups together. Just it's more natural, and it helps utilize the space a little bit better if you're not splitting them up.
Let's say if we would want to keep them just as pets, would keeping them individually be the ideal situation?
Not individually, in pairs.
Okay.
And that would be true of especially the Tinctorius group, like those Azurias, the blue guys. What happens if you have two males in a tank or two females in a tank is they usually beat on and bully each other, and you usually end up with a loser, somebody who's not getting to eat as much as the other frogs just because the other frogs are beating up on it and, kicking it around. And so in those type of situations, we recommend that people keep poison dart frogs in pairs, male and female groups.
And so what's the benefit of having a pair?
The benefit, socially, the frogs aren't going to, it is a detriment to the frogs to be alone. It just allows people to see kind of that natural life cycle there in the tank of them laying eggs, taking care of the tadpole, and seeing frogs emerge.
Okay, and how about different species? How well do they get along?
That, unfortunately, that is the second most common question we get right after, are they still poisonous? Is, hey, can I throw in different colors altogether? And unfortunately, as a rule of thumb, we say no. Unfortunately, they tend to be very territorial and aggressive towards frogs that don't look like them. In the frog's mind, they're thinking, hey, in this space, I have these breeding spots and I have these feeding spots that are available to me. And if other frogs are coming into my territory, that limits the breeding spots and the feeding spots that I actually have to utilize. And so I'm going to try to kick these people out. I'm going to try to be mean and be a bully. I want them to move on and find another spot. And what happens when we trap the frogs in a glass tank like that, those frogs don't have another space to move to. They don't have another opportunity to find a different location. And so they tend to that constant stress of fighting and trying to exert their dominance over each other just stresses the frogs out. They tend to not get as much to eat, or they tend to just constantly be in stress of having somebody who doesn't want them in their area around. And so as a rule of thumb, we recommend that people don't mix frogs. And usually those type of aggression doesn't happen until they're adults, usually depending on the species, anywhere from 6 months to a little over a year. You don't tend to see as much aggression, but definitely when they're adults, you'll see a lot of that. Now, some people do take some frogs, mix them together when they're really young and raise them up together. And sometimes it works out, but if it doesn't work out, it's pretty detrimental.
Yeah.
So as a rule of thumb, we just recommend against it.
So if we're going to be starting off with frogs, and often we get them young, how would we get a pair?
That's a great question. There have been some people that have theorized that that they might not have a sex when they're young. That might be something that's developed later on in life, which would be pretty interesting. But what most people do is buy some juveniles, keep them together, and then once they start to see the sexual dimorphism, they start to see changes in the body shape that says, hey, these guys are males and these guys are females, then they separate them or trade them off to other people that are looking for different sexes. So, you might buy, 3 dart frogs, put them in a tank together, and, hey, around that year mark, you're looking and saying, oh, you know what? I think I have 2 females and a male. And then you're looking for somebody that has an extra male that either wants your female or are split off the tank and keep them in pairs. So most of the time, people are trading or selling off once they get sexually mature.
Okay, so overall, how hard is it to keep dart frogs?
Probably the hardest part about keeping dart frogs is keeping a schedule with your fruit flies. When you're keeping dart frogs, most people are using the melanogaster fruit flies, which are the smaller of the 2 fruit fly species. And then most chameleon people are using the Hydei, the larger. With the melanogaster, their life cycle is 2 weeks, whereas with the Hydei, their life cycle is 3 weeks. So depending on which fly species you're using, keeping a schedule where if you're using melanogaster, every 2 weeks you're starting new cultures, and if you're using Hydei, every 3 weeks you're starting cultures, and keeping on that schedule, probably the hardest part about keeping poison dart frogs, making sure that you're staying on that cycle, because with that food source, the fruit flies, they're not producing any flies with melanogaster 10 to 12 days, and with Hydei 17 to 20 days, they're not producing any flies. And so if you get behind, you can be in a spot where you don't have any flies to feed your animals, and you'll have to order some more in or trade with somebody local to get some fruit flies. So the hardest part about keeping dart frogs definitely is maintaining that schedule of the fruit flies and starting new cultures.
Okay, so say we had the idea that, wow, we would love to breed these. How hard is it to breed dart frogs?
It's very, very easy. The dart frogs do all of the work. If you're looking to maximize production from the dart frogs, you'll want to pull the eggs when they're laid and want to take care of those outside the tank. So using some what's called tadpole tea, using either a blackwater extract to make tadpole tea or Indian almond leaves to make tadpole tea, to make the water slightly acidic, keeps away any mold or fungus, and keeping those eggs damp like the male would inside the tank or out in the rainforest. And then when those guys hatch, putting those each individual tadpole in its own individual cup so that it doesn't eat its brothers and sisters, and taking care of those tadpoles, just like you would like a betta fish, feeding it on a regular basis and then extracting waste from the cup of water. So as far as ease, definitely pretty easy when it comes to frogs. They're very, very easy to breed.
Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job covering the basics of how to keep these beautiful little guys. Is there anything else you'd like to share about keeping dart frogs?
Just that I think that poison dart frogs have been very popular over the last decade and have grown in popularity. And I think that, when you're talking about keeping something that, is kind of shockingly beautiful, poison dart frogs really hit that bill. And I think for people keeping chameleons, it's a great opportunity, to kind of give you an excuse to keep fruit flies year round. So when your chameleons hatch, you have a food source that you can start them on right away. So they make really easy pets, and definitely a showstopper when it comes to exotic animals with the colors that you can get in poison dart frogs.
All right, Josh, thank you so much for coming on. There's lots of chameleon keepers out there that love dart frogs, and lots that would like to get to know them.
Great, Bill. It was fun to talk dart frogs with you and the community that you've built.
I have been looking forward to publishing this episode for a while. Josh is an inspiration to anyone who has a dream of what they want to do with their life. He had a passion and was able to make it a job he loves. Remember, he started with deli cups.
The other reason is that I love keeping dart frogs. They are one of the most enjoyable outer fringe animals I have kept. They are beautiful, and they lend themselves to beautiful vivariums, which then become centerpieces in your home. And to top it off, they're actually pretty easy. A big thank you to Josh for coming on and introducing us to the world of these frogs. If you're interested in getting involved with dart frogs, you may find a wide variety of species and further information at joshsfrogs.com. Type it in your browser or go to the show notes where you'll find a link. And that concludes this week's episode. We are incredibly lucky to have such an awesome variety of fascinating creatures to interact with and observe. Have a good weekend, and I will see you next week. This is your host, Bill Strand, signing off. Go into that world and soak up everything that it has to offer. Learn, understand, and pass it on. This is our community. Take care of each other and keep us strong.